Have you ever woken up in the dead of night, certain that someone or something was standing right there beside your bed? Maybe you told yourself it was just a dream, maybe just a shadow, or maybe just the house settling. But what if it wasn't? What if that breath you swore you felt on your cheek didn't come from you? Tonight, on this special Halloween episode, we're diving into real ghost encounters, stories sent in from listeners and collected from forgotten corners of the internet. These aren't the kind of tales you hear in blockbuster movies. They're quiet, chilling whispers from people like you, people who swear they've seen, felt, and even heard the presence of something that doesn't belong in our world. So, grab a blanket, turn off the lights if you dare, and prepare to hear voices from the dark. The first story comes from Emily, a young woman who grew up in a farmhouse in Pennsylvania. The house had been in her family for generations, and with old houses come old histories. Emily writes, "When I was 13, I started sleeping in what used to be my grandmother's bedroom. It was a cozy space, with lace curtains and the faint smell of lavender that never seemed to fade. For the first few nights, everything was fine. But then I started waking up at exactly 3:15 a.m. every single night." Emily describes how at first she brushed it off. Teens wake up at weird hours. But soon, it became impossible to ignore. She says she would feel the bed dip slightly, as if someone had just sat down at the edge. When she dared to open her eyes, there was nothing. One night, however, curiosity overpowered fear. She stayed still, pretending to sleep. At 3:15 on the dot, she felt that same weight press down on the mattress. Slowly, cautiously, she cracked her eyes open. And there, just inches from her face, she saw the faint outline of a woman with silver hair, humming softly. Emily swears she recognized the lullaby. It was the same tune her grandmother used to sing to her as a child. But here's the catch. Her grandmother had passed away 3 years earlier. Instead of screaming, Emily whispered, "Grandma?" The figure froze, the humming stopped, and then, just like smoke, the image dissolved into the air. What makes Emily's story fascinating is not just the apparition itself, but the way it tied to her family history. Psychologists often argue that when we experience grief, our brains sometimes replay familiar memories in the form of dreams or hallucinations. But Emily insists this wasn't a dream. She remembers the texture of the sheets, the way her heart raced, the silence after the humming ceased. And honestly, isn't it possible that the bonds of love stretch beyond the grave? Whether you believe in spirits or not, there's something undeniably comforting, yet terrifying, about the thought of a loved one watching over us from the other side. The next encounter comes from a man named Daniel, who lived for a time in New Orleans, a city known for its voodoo legends, jazz-filled nights, and yes, its ghosts. Daniel worked the night shift at a small hotel in the French Quarter, a place where history lingers in every cracked brick and wrought iron balcony. It was around 2 a.m, Daniel recalls, and I was sitting at the front desk going through paperwork. The lobby was silent, and I knew all the guests were in their rooms. That's when I heard the elevator ding. Here's the thing. The hotel's elevator had been out of service for weeks. There was even a sign taped across the door. Yet Daniel watched as the light above the elevator flicked from floor to floor. 3, 4, 5, until it stopped at the lobby. The doors slid open with a metallic groan. No one stepped out. Daniel, trying to calm himself, walked over to check. The elevator was empty, but he said he felt an icy breeze sweep past him, as if someone invisible had rushed by. Moments later, he heard footsteps echoing down the hall toward the ballroom, a room that had been locked for years. When he got the courage to follow, he found the ballroom door ajar, swaying slightly. Inside, the grand chandeliers were unlit, the floor covered in dust. But he swears he heard faint jazz music, like a gramophone struggling to play an old record. And just as he strained to listen, the door slammed shut behind him. Daniel quit that job a week later. Now, skeptics might say, okay, old buildings creak, machinery malfunctions, minds play tricks at night. And yes, that's true. But what makes Daniel's encounter stick out is how it matches decades of other reports about that very hotel. Guests have long claimed to hear music, laughter, even the sound of glasses clinking in the empty ballroom. Local lore suggests the hotel was once the site of a speakeasy during Prohibition, and perhaps those who partied there simply never left. Think about that. An eternal party replaying in the shadows of New Orleans. Some might call it a curse. Others, a celebration that death itself couldn't silence. Our third story comes from a listener named Claire, who grew up in the Midwest. Unlike the first two tales that centered around historic, almost picturesque locations, Claire's story takes place in the most ordinary of settings, a quiet suburban home on a tree-lined street. And maybe that's what makes it so unsettling. The idea that the supernatural doesn't just haunt old hotels or forgotten cemeteries. Sometimes it finds you right where you live. Claire remembers being about 8 years old when she first noticed the man in the hallway. She explains, "It always started the same way. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, usually around 2 or 3 a.m., and feel like I needed to go to the bathroom. When I stepped into the hallway, there he was, standing perfectly still at the far end, a tall, dark figure, no features, no face, just a shadow that somehow felt more solid than it should. At first, Claire assumed she was half asleep and imagining things. But the figure appeared night after night, always in the same spot. Sometimes she'd rub her eyes or blink hard, and the figure would vanish, only to reappear the next time. The strangest part? Her younger brother eventually confessed that he had seen the same man. "He's really tall," her brother whispered one morning at breakfast. "And he doesn't move, but I know he's looking at me." Their parents dismissed it as childhood imagination, the way parents often do. But years later, after the family moved to another house, Claire's mother admitted she too had once seen the figure, just for a split second, when she turned off the hallway lights before bed. She described the same sensation her children had felt. The figure wasn't just a shadow. It was watching. Now, let's pause and think about this. From a psychological standpoint, shared hallucinations are rare, especially among children and adults experiencing them at different times. One explanation could be sleep paralysis, a condition that often involves shadowy figures. But in Claire's case, she was fully awake, walking, functioning. Could this be an example of what paranormal researchers call a residual haunting? A leftover imprint of something or someone that never left the space? Regardless of the explanation, Claire says the memory still chills her decades later. Even now, as an adult, she leaves a hallway light on at night, just in case. Our next submission takes us far from the suburbs and into the wild landscapes of the American West. It comes from a man named Jack, who worked for years as a park ranger in Utah. Jack's job was to patrol remote trails, assist lost hikers, and make sure visitors respected the land. What he didn't expect was to find himself in the middle of something he couldn't explain. One evening, Jack writes, I was on patrol near an old mining site that had been abandoned since the late 1800s. The sun was setting, and the whole place had that eerie glow you get in the desert when the sky turns orange and purple. I was about to radio in when I heard the sound of picks striking rock. Clear as day, Jack followed the sound, convinced maybe a group of kids had wandered into a restricted area. But when he arrived, the site was empty. The air was perfectly still, except for that rhythmic clang, clang, clang of metal against stone, echoing all around him. He shined his flashlight into one of the mine shafts and swore he saw movement. Figures carrying lanterns, their light flickering against the rock walls. He called out, but the figures didn't respond. Instead, the lights moved deeper into the shaft until they vanished altogether. The next morning, Jack returned with another ranger. They found no footprints, no equipment, nothing but silence. Yet locals in the nearby town weren't surprised. They told him that many miners had died in that area from cave-ins, accidents, even fires. According to legend, their spirits still toil in the earth, forever chasing the veins of silver they never managed to extract in life. Jack insists he's a practical man, not one to jump to supernatural conclusions. But to this day, when he hears the faint ring of metal in the distance, he says the hairs on his neck stand on end. Now, whether you view Jack's account as ghostly or psychological, it ties into something deeper. The idea that human ambition, labor, and tragedy can leave imprints on a place. Ghost stories aren't just about fear. They're about memory. And sometimes memory refuses to fade. Our fifth story brings us back indoors to a very different setting. A college dormitory. A student named Rachel submitted this one, and if you've ever lived in an old dorm, you know how creaky, unsettling those buildings can feel at night. But Rachel swears this went far beyond ordinary creaks. It was finals week, she recalls, and I stayed up late studying. Around 3 a.m, I finally lay down. Just as I was drifting off, I heard the faint sound of typing. At first, I thought my roommate had gotten up to use her laptop, but when I glanced across the room, she was sound asleep. The typing continued, fast, rhythmic, urgent. Rachel sat up, heart racing. The sound was coming from her own desk. She could see the faint glow of her laptop screen, but she hadn't turned it on. Slowly, she got out of bed, walked over, and watched as the keys pressed down one by one, typing words onto a blank document. She froze, reading the message appear letter by letter. I never finished my work. Then the screen flickered and went dark. Rachel screamed, waking her roommate. When she explained what happened, her roommate turned pale and admitted she had heard similar noises before. Typing, pages turning, whispers. And here's the kicker. Months later, Rachel learned that a student had died in that very room years earlier, right in the middle of finals week. From a cultural standpoint, stories like Rachel's often symbolize stress, pressure, and the weight of unfinished tasks. Psychologists might say her brain, overloaded from studying, conjured the experience. But Rachel insists it was real. She can still see the unfinished sentence burned into her memory, and maybe that's the point. Sometimes ghosts are more than just figures in the dark. Sometimes they're reflections of our deepest anxieties, the things left undone, the weight of expectations, the fear of not completing what we've started. So far tonight, we've explored family spirits, hotel hauntings, shadowy figures, ghostly miners, and a restless student trapped in time. And these are just the beginning. As we move deeper into this compilation, you'll notice a theme. Each encounter tells us something about the people who experienced it, about love, about fear, about memory, about ambition. But most importantly, they remind us that maybe, just maybe, the veil between the living and the dead is thinner than we think. Our sixth encounter comes from a nurse named Maria, who worked the night shift at a hospital in Chicago. Hospitals, as you might imagine, are often considered prime locations for ghostly activity. They're places of birth and death, of healing and heartbreak. Maria had always brushed off the whispers among staff about strange occurrences on certain floors, until one night when she saw it for herself. It was just after 2 a.m., she recalls. I was charting at the nurse's station when I noticed movement down the hall. At first, I thought it was a patient out of bed. But the figure wasn't walking. It was gliding. Maria describes a woman in an old-fashioned hospital gown, pale and translucent, moving silently past the rooms. She called out, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned into an empty, patient room. Maria rushed to follow, but when she entered, the room was empty. The bed neatly made, the curtains still, and yet The air was ice cold. Later, when she mentioned the encounter to another nurse, the woman simply nodded and said, "You've seen her too, then. We call her the Lady in White. She's been here longer than any of us." Stories like Maria's remind us that hospitals are more than clinical spaces. They're places where countless human stories intersect. From a cultural perspective, ghostly apparitions in hospitals are often seen as the lingering energy of those who passed away suddenly or tragically. Whether it's a projection of grief, stress, or something truly supernatural, Maria swears the memory will never leave her. Our seventh submission takes us to the deep South. In a small town in Georgia, a man named Thomas shares his childhood memory of living in a house that everyone in the neighborhood whispered about. They said the house was cursed, Thomas writes, but to me it was just home, at least until the night I saw her. Thomas remembers waking to the sound of water dripping. He followed the noise into the kitchen, where he found the faucet turned on, trickling into the sink. As he reached to shut it off, he saw a reflection in the window above the sink, a woman standing behind him. But when he spun around, no one was there. The reflection remained. She was wearing a long, dark dress, her face pale and sorrowful. Thomas froze, unable to move, until the figure faded like mist. Terrified, he told his parents the next day. To his shock, his mother confessed that she too had seen the woman, often late at night, always near the kitchen window. Years later, Thomas learned that the house had been built on land where a widow had once lived during the Civil War. Her husband never returned from battle, and local legend claimed she would stare out the kitchen window night after night, waiting for him. Psychologically, we might see this as a manifestation of grief, a story passed down so vividly that new generations unconsciously recreate it. But Thomas insists what he saw wasn't a trick of memory. "I didn't know the story at the time," he says. "All I knew was the woman in the window was real." The eighth encounter in tonight's compilation comes from an unlikely source. A truck driver named Steve, who spends most of his life on the road. For Steve, the highway is home, and sometimes the open road has its own phantoms. "It was about midnight," Steve recalls. "I was driving along a stretch of interstate in Arizona, empty desert on both sides. Suddenly, I saw a woman standing on the shoulder, waving her arms like she needed help." Steve slowed, thinking maybe her car had broken down. But as his headlights illuminated her, he realized she wasn't standing on solid ground. Her feet were hovering inches above the gravel. "I slammed on the brakes," Steve says, "but by the time I stopped, she was gone. Just gone. I got out, looked around, nothing. No footprints, no car, no sign of anyone. Just desert." Later, at a truck stop, Steve mentioned what he'd seen. An older driver leaned in and told him that others had reported the same woman for years, always in that same stretch of highway. Some call her the Phantom Hitchhiker, a recurring figure in roadside folklore across America. From a cultural perspective, Phantom Hitchhiker stories are fascinating because they appear in so many regions, often with strikingly similar details. Some say it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of the road. Others believe these are restless spirits, doomed to repeat their final moments. Whatever the case, Steve admits he still avoids that highway whenever he can. Our ninth story brings us back to the Midwest, this time from a listener named Olivia, who worked at a historic theater. "The theater was beautiful," Olivia explains. "Velvet seats, golden chandeliers, creaky wooden floors. But everyone said it was haunted." One night after closing, Olivia was locking up when she heard applause. The auditorium was empty, the stage dark. She assumed maybe a sound system glitch. But then she heard a man's voice, faint but clear. "Encore." Olivia turned on the lights, checked the rows. Nothing. She decided to leave quickly, but just as she reached the exit, the piano on stage played a single note. Later, she discovered that a famous actor had collapsed and died mid-performance in that very theater decades ago. Since then, staff and performers reported hearing clapping, voices, even instruments playing by themselves. Psychologists might argue that performers and workers in high-stress creative environments are more prone to suggestion. But Olivia insists the experience was real. "I wasn't scared, exactly," she says. "It felt more like someone refusing to leave the stage, someone who still loved the spotlight." And finally, for this segment, we have a story from Ethan, a man who rented a cabin in the woods of Vermont for a quiet writing retreat. "The first few nights were peaceful," he writes. "But then I started hearing footsteps on the porch at exactly midnight. Slow, heavy steps that circled the cabin. At first, Ethan thought it might be wildlife. But when he finally worked up the courage to look out the window, he saw a figure in a long coat, face obscured by shadow, pacing in the snow. When he flung open the door, The porch was empty, but the snow bore no footprints. Ethan left the cabin the next morning. Later, he learned that years earlier, the property had belonged to a reclusive man who was known for pacing his porch late at night, mumbling to himself. Some say he vanished during a blizzard, never found again. For Ethan, the experience was both terrifying and strangely inspiring. "I didn't get much writing done," he admits, "but I left with a story I'll never forget." Each of these stories, from hospitals to highways, theaters to cabins, remind us that ghosts aren't confined to one type of place. They show up wherever human lives leave their strongest marks. Whether we see them as echoes of the past, manifestations of memory, or genuine spirits crossing the veil, one thing is certain: the experiences leave a lasting impression on those who encounter them. Our 10th story comes from Hannah, a woman who spent her summers working at a camp in the forests of Maine. The cabins were rustic, the nights pitch black, and the woods seemed alive with whispers. Hannah had heard plenty of ghost stories from fellow counselors, but one night she experienced something she says she'll never forget. "It was late," Hannah recalls. "I had finished checking on the campers and was walking back to my own cabin. The path was lit only by moonlight. That's when I heard singing, soft, distant, like a lullaby." She followed the sound to the edge of the lake, where she saw a figure standing knee-deep in the water. A woman, long hair flowing, swaying gently as she sang. Hannah called out, thinking it was perhaps another counselor. But the figure didn't respond. Instead, she slowly turned her head, and Hannah realized with a chill that the woman's face was featureless, smooth as porcelain. Terrified, Hannah bolted back to her cabin. The next morning, when she told an older staff member, the woman nodded gravely and said, "That's the Lady of the Lake. Campers have been seeing her for generations." Local legend claimed the spirit was of a young woman who drowned decades earlier, searching for her lost child. For Hannah, the detail that stuck with her most wasn't the faceless apparition. It was the lullaby. "It was so beautiful," she admits, "but also so wrong. Like something meant to comfort that had been twisted into something eerie." From a psychological angle, Hannah's story could represent how our brains process grief, fear, and the primal unease of water at night. But culturally, water spirits appear across countless traditions, from Celtic banshees to Japanese yurei. reminding us that humanity has long associated water with the boundary between life and death. Our 11th submission comes from a retired police officer named Mark. He spent over 30 years on the force in Michigan. And while he's seen his fair share of things, one night left him questioning everything he thought he knew about reality. We got a call about a disturbance at an abandoned house on the edge of town, Mark says. Teenagers sometimes broke in, so I didn't think much of it. I went with my partner to check it out. The house was in ruins. Broken windows, sagging floors, the smell of mold. As they searched room by room, Mark heard footsteps upstairs. They called out. No answer. Guns drawn, they climbed the stairs. At the end of the hallway, they saw a figure. A man in a dark suit, standing perfectly still. Mark ordered him to show his hands. Instead, the figure turned and walked into a room. When they entered seconds later, the room was empty. No windows, no other doors, just peeling wallpaper and silence. Mark's partner turned pale. Without a word, they both left the house and never filed an official report. I've seen criminals. I've seen tragedies, Mark says. But that was different. That was something I couldn't explain. What makes this story compelling is its source. Police officers are trained observers, accustomed to chaos and adrenaline. For someone like Mark to admit to a paranormal encounter lends weight to the possibility that something truly unexplainable occurred. The 12th encounter takes us to the Pacific Northwest, where a woman named Sophie worked as a librarian. Sophie loved the quiet stacks of the old library, the smell of books, the way time seemed to pause between the shelves. But she also knew the building had a reputation. We used to joke about the ghost of the 3rd floor, Sophie explains. But then I saw him myself. Late one evening, Sophie was shelving books when she heard footsteps. Thinking it was a coworker, she called out. No response. The steps grew louder, closer, until she looked up and saw a man in a tweed jacket and bow tie walking toward her. She blinked, and he was gone. Later, she learned that decades earlier, a professor had collapsed and died in that very section of the library while preparing a lecture. Staff had whispered about him ever since. Sophie doesn't describe the encounter as frightening, though. It felt peaceful, she says, like he was still searching for his books. This story highlights an important aspect of ghost lore. Not all spirits are terrifying. Some are simply echoes of lives lived with passion, lingering in the spaces they loved. Our 13th story brings us to Texas, where a young couple, Mia and Carlos, rented an old farmhouse. They were newly married, full of excitement, but strange things began happening almost immediately. We'd hear knocking on the walls at night, Mia recalls, and not random knocks, patterns, like someone trying to communicate. At first, they laughed it off, but then objects began moving. A vase shifting inches across the table, a chair sliding back from the kitchen counter. The most terrifying moment came one evening when Carlos walked into the bedroom to find all the drawers pulled open, clothes strewn across the floor, and a single word scratched into the mirror: leave. The couple moved out within weeks. Later, they learned that the farmhouse had once belonged to a man who died violently on the property. Locals said his spirit remained, angry at anyone else living there. Culturally, this type of story taps into one of humanity's oldest fears: being unwelcome in our own homes. Psychologists might interpret it as stress manifesting in exaggerated perceptions. But Mia and Carlos remain convinced they encountered something hostile, something that didn't want them there. The 14th encounter is lighter in tone, though no less mysterious. It comes from a musician named Alex, who rented a small recording studio in Los Angeles. "I'd be working late," Alex writes, "and I'd hear humming. At first I thought it was a neighbor, but then I realized it was coming through the monitors." He describes how the humming would weave into the music he was recording, sometimes harmonizing with the melody. Curious, he left the microphones on one night while he stepped out. When he played back the recording, he heard not just humming, but faint laughter, like a child enjoying the music. Instead of fear, Alex says he felt inspired. "I like to think it was some kind of spirit who loved music and wanted to join in," he explains. "I even left a mic open for them, just in case." Stories like Alex's remind us that paranormal encounters don't always inspire dread. Sometimes they carry wonder, connection, even creativity. Whether psychological projection or something beyond, they tap into humanity's need for companionship, even across realms. So far, we've traveled through hospitals, highways, theaters, cabins, libraries, and recording studios. Each story adds a thread to a larger tapestry: the ways people experience the unknown. Some encounters are terrifying, others melancholic, and still others strangely comforting. But all share one truth: Once you've experienced something that defies explanation, it stays with you. You replay it, analyze it, try to rationalize it, but deep down, you know it was real to you. And that's enough to haunt you for a lifetime. As our midnight journey nears its end, let us pause once more. We have walked among the halls of Waverly Hills, drifted through the cells of Alcatraz, and stood beneath the moonlight of Hollywood Forever Cemetery. Each story carried with it whispers of the past, fragments of lives, fears, and unanswered mysteries that refuse to fade away. What is it about these places that holds us so tightly in their grasp? Perhaps it is the way they remind us of our own fragility, of how easily time erases names, but never quite silences memories. Or maybe it is the thrill of standing where others claim the veil has thinned, where the ordinary collides with the unknown. Haunted places are not just about ghosts. They are about us, the stories we tell, the fears we carry, the questions we dare to ask in the dark. Whether you believe in restless spirits or not, there is power in these tales. Power to make the hairs on your arms rise. Power to make your heart beat just a little faster when you hear a creak in an empty hallway. Power to remind you that in the grand mystery of existence, there is still so much we do not understand. So tonight, as you turn off the lights and close your eyes, ask yourself, what lingers in the silence? Is it only your imagination or something more? Thank you for joining me on this midnight exploration of America's most haunted places. Until next time, keep your mind open, your heart steady, and remember, shadows are never empty.